This is Ubersu and welcome back to my original content. Enough with Ukraine. Everyone is tired from it and I'm tired from it too. Plus I have already spoken my piece and if you want to read it, you can go to Telegram. But for now there likely won't be any videos about it. Now, originally I intended this video to be a detailed review of the debate between Vaush and Whatifalthist, who I'll refer to until the end of this video as Mr. Lynch. At the same time, I didn't want to make the video too long, as it looks like you're not even watching until the end of all of my videos, so I won't be dissecting every single argument that they have made. Instead, I'll provide you with a brief summary, which subsequently I will analyze, and provide my critical commentary. And the start didn't go quite well for Mr. Lynch, who although started the conversation with a clear premise unlike Vaush that inequality breeds radicalism and these radicalism are often very resentful and generally not a good thing for a society, supporting that with a historical analysis that had appeared in his original video, with which Vaush to an extent agree with. However, the conversation went down south shortly after that, when Vaush claimed that the modern left, branded as social justice, is a continuation of the civil rights era, and Mr. Lynch, being a post-civil rights conservative that he is, disagreed with that framework because he had to.
I don't think it's useful to parcel out what percentage of each philosophy, and yes, you could find some Marxist influence in the civil rights movement, but I don't think it's useful.
And it became the only part of the video where Mr. Lynch was clearly losing.
You said there's no way the abolitionist movement
the question.
could have led to the civil rights movement. How are these not the same movement?
In the way I will.
How are these
I've answered my question in the best way I can. Bro, I answered the question. Like
you answered it wrong. You were incorrect.
And becoming easily irritated. The conversation then moved to discussing economics and productivity, a topic in which Vaush knows very little about, which is clearly shown by his understanding of productivity during the debate and not post-debate mumblings.
The basic gist of it is that people like him will justify American economic supremacy by arguing that poorer countries are less productive, and they'll define productivity as how much wealth they produce, which is obviously cyclical.
Yet, Mr. Lynch, despite his more superior knowledge, seemed to have failed to make any significant points either, except for exposing Vaush for lack of knowledge.
How many books on American intellectual history have you read? Give me some titles. Give me some book titles to back up what you're saying. How many economics books have you read? Give me your top 3.
All of them.
Give me your top 3.
I can't. I enjoy all of them equally. So anyway...
That likely the audience didn't even notice because of the Vaush's excellent control over the conversation. So the second part of the conversation was a technical draw. Finally, during the last part of the conversation, Mr. Lynch went at Vaush with the classic "you're a dumb commie who wants to destroy society," and Vaush responding with the classical "dude, those over 50 attempts at socialism weren't real."
All I said is that the Soviet Union's actual effective, the political reality just was not a product of Marxian theory, which is obviously true.
And although it was a technical draw, Vaush looked even more unread than he was during the second part of the video. At least this is what almost every single history teacher will tell to someone who is saying that the Soviet Union wasn't trying Marxism. And aside from that, there were also minor discussions about how an idea was spreading that I found Vaush to, of course, coming on top because he had demonstrated more control of the conversation, and small occurrences that are not worthy of any commentary that looked really cringe, such as this.
I agree.
So why
they're
is all
different
of that being
countries.
Down to racist?
I agree. Wait, hold on. Calm down.
You said that the
You're
only
very. Oh
definition
my
you
God!
could
Please.
For
Please.
in
I'm begging you.
is racism.
Calm.
Please explain.
I wasn't accusing you of being racist right here. I was asking you.
Said that.
Calm.
Go
please
back into the
quit
video.
being defensive. Wait, please, please.
Go ahead and look at it.
Oh my God, please! I'm begging you. I was asking you a question. I was asking you a yes/no question. So anyway, the racist thing here is that I don't think it makes you racist to make those arguments, but I do think that people arrive at racist conclusions by framing productivity in that way when looking at the wealth produced by all these different countries.
Yet the fundamental takeaway was that nobody won. Kind of nobody won. I'll explain why shortly, but this sentiment was shared both by Vaush's and Mr. Lynch's audiences, who all called for moderators to handle the situation, as both parties talked past and over each other, and practically no topic of the conversation was felt like finished. The obvious strength that Vaush had in this debate is his rhetoric and, dare I say, his common sense with which he had approached the situation, despite his significant lack of knowledge almost about all the topics he has talked about that he refuses to even acknowledge in the aftermath.
Rigor, the problem is Vaush doesn't have enough reading in the necessary academic topics, especially economics and history. No, I disagree. I actually think that I knew everything that I needed there.
Mr. Lynch, on the other hand, isn't debating people on a daily basis, but reads a lot of books, and consequently his skills of rhetoric and the flow of conversation were significantly weaker compared to Vaush's, as evidenced by his irritated and nervous behavior being manifested throughout the conversation. He wasn't able to hear the arguments that were made by Vaush, instead preferring to focus on arguments that were made by other people, even if they are not directly tied to what Vaush was saying, or sometimes even the exact topic of the conversation, which made him appear like an NPC, and consequently this made himself walk into a trap in the first part of the debate that I'll review in a few minutes. Yet he nonetheless managed to save himself from a humiliation by citing the literary support for the narrative that he agrees with.
I think he just has tidbits of information that he's acquired because they fit into, like, they help him justify the political positions that he had.
As opposed to Vaush, who did not have any historical support and has relied on his skill of rhetoric and common sense, because let's be honest, this guy doesn't read any books. Now, the irony of this debate is that the famous cultural meme of lefty making a wall of text and a right-winger says a thing or two to support his message and then ultimately wins, that has been ingrained in our popular imagination so deeply, was essentially reversed in this debate. Here, there appeared a very knowledgeable right-winger who has given Vaush a lecture on history, which may not be directly related to a topic of discussion, while Vaush, on the other hand, took the role of a low-informed left-winger who's all about the common sense, trying to make his argument.
Like, you looked up at the stars and you wanted to see a dinosaur, and it didn't really matter what the stars looked like. You had to find the dinosaur in the constellation, you know what I mean?
And consequently, if your knowledge is very small with regards to socialism and economics as Vaush's is in comparison to Mr. Lynch, then you'd likely think that Vaush has won, like, no questions asked. He appeared more rhetorically skilled and he made more sense, at least you could follow him through. He controlled the conversation and talked in simple words that were easy to understand, as opposed to Mr. Lynch, who was all over the place. And if I were a person of little political literacy, which, as I'm sure about 90% of Vaush's audiences are, and likely 80% of Lynch's audience are, I think that Vaush won because of the skill that he has learned through his entire career, a skill of setting the frame, controlling the conversation, and making his opponent look like an idiot that plays by Vaush's rules. He is very skilled in that regard, and certainly this skill covers any holes in knowledge that he has. Perhaps the moment that had irritated me the most about this debate as a right-winger was the civil rights discussion that Vaush won hands off, and Mr. Lynch appeared to using his superior knowledge in a dishonest manner. Mr. Lynch's argument was that social justice isn't a continuation of the civil rights, it is instead being a continuation of the New Left movement. Vaush, on the other hand, had clearly identified a continuity between the civil rights and the New Left, and yes, Marxism, which by the way greatly influenced Martin Luther King as well. But unfortunately, Mr. Lynch's ideology of egalitarianism, consensus conservatism, and a blindness to power relations did not allow him to view the civil rights era critically, in which many major thinkers of the civil rights era were cultural Marxists, had ties with extremist leftist organizations, and more significantly more violent than the 2020 George Floyd riots. He furthermore did not see even the legal continuity between the civil rights era and whatever we experience now. Aside from his personal bias against BLM and the like for the civil rights, the central goal of the civil rights that most most of its leaders agreed upon were vague equalizing of the races, which may take the form of illegal equality but also material equality, in addition to a significant demand for power reversals, and consequently Mr. Lynch walked himself into a trap which was capitalized by Vaush. Now, the worst thing about the civil rights is that the races were not even equalized politically in the aftermath. Blacks received affirmative action in an attempt to equalize the races in outcomes due to a belief in biological racial equality that I'm sure Mr. Lynch shares as well, and consequently such legislation pushed not an equality of rights but rather equality of outcomes, which is combined with resentment that people have against whites, represented a start of a reversal of power relations that is continuing to this day with an increasing pace, where now it is perfectly fine and acceptable to punish white defendants more harshly by black judges by a rate of 2. Similarly is the issue with the discrimination at hiring grounds, where any diversity initiative could be understood as a code for whites need not apply, which consequently decreases the likelihood of white employees getting hired, not even speaking about the whole project of diversity, which significantly decreases their mental health. Now, if the civil rights were truly about equal treatment as opposed to starting the process of power reversals, they would never have enacted the affirmative action that all current beneficial treatment of non-whites and the dispossession of whites is built upon. I'm sorry, it's just what it is. Now, personally, as I'm sure an overwhelming majority of right-wingers believe that there should be equal treatment of the race, and this is why many of us talked about the unfair portrayal of whites in the media and the popular imagination that fuels this resentment, where only 5,000 to 6,000 articles are made about white victims of black crime, yet about 260,000 articles are made about black victims, despite the fact that interracial violence goes only one way and whites are the ones on the receiving end of it. But still, those who direct public opinion say it's not good enough, and we should cry more for blacks and punish whites even more harshly.
You cannot talk about any other issue without talking about how race informs that issue. And when someone says it's about class, that tends to function as a way to get race off the table.
But Jesus Christ, you don't have to buy it as a right-winger or a conservative. It did start during the civil rights era, and stop looking at the civil rights through pink lenses provided by our social consensus that is, by the way, now is changing into a message that yes, the civil rights were violent and today is the new civil rights movement and we're going to demand even more power reversal until you're totally dispossessed. I hated that Vaush appeared accurate in this segment, but it doesn't have to be like that. Don't treat the civil rights as the French treat the French Revolution. It's not magnificent, from which we could build our new founding myths upon, and likely if you look through it at the retrospect isn't a good thing overall, and now it could be a good thing, even a magnificent thing, had it actually been about ending segregation and providing all races with equal treatment, but sadly it's not. Stop lying to yourself, you're just helping our enemies. Now, he could also have attacked Vaush's failure to understand the Soviet Union. Mr. Lynch could cite the early Soviet leaders and the debates they had about actually building communism that was in line with Marxian thought and why it has started breaking away from that vision. And no leftist would deny or disagree that such debates were had and that the early years of the Soviet Union were indeed about trying to build communism, which later, after a series of debates, were abandoned because of the inability to do so. And the Soviet Union, through the remaining of its time, ended up being stuck at the socialist level. This, in combination with the claim that all socialist/communist societies fail, would have been the knockout if he had pulled it off, and consequently the audience would have had a consensus on who the winner of the debate was. Now, the other thing that I'm mad about is that Mr. Lynch didn't also go with the entropy argument that has been argued by many right-wingers, especially now, both socially and biologically, and although Mr. Lynch could have pulled a John Stephen Glaub or Arnold Toynbee, he surely wouldn't have pulled a Michael Woodley or an Edward Dutton. This, I feel, would have been much better than just convincing Vaush that his ideas will never work, because this actually provides a tempting sociological and sociobiological framework with which you can look at the world, much like evolutionary or Marxist lenses. Now, I'm sorry if I appeared ranting too much at the end, but I think we need to set high standards for ourselves when it comes to pushing our message. Though the fact that Mr. Lynch didn't secure a victory is easily explained by his lack of experience and of course being very nervous, which shows, but hopefully Mr. Lynch will sometimes stumble upon this video and make the right deduction, and hopefully you will give me a few shekels on PayPal or Subscribestar, as I'm already banned on Patreon, and once again thank you for watching.